They said the Appalachians keep their secrets buried under roots, bones, and silence. But in the winter of 1961, two of those secrets walked out of the tree line on their own. The Harlow Twins, missing for 13 years, appeared on the side of an old logging road, barefoot in the snow, clutching each other's hands like they were still running from something. Their skin was cold, their eyes unfocused, and when the sheriff asked where they'd been, both boys answered at the same time, in the same trembling whisper, "We finally got away." But by the time they were taken into town, everyone who met them understood one thing: whatever they escaped from out there wasn't finished with them yet. In the winter of 1961, the Appalachians were locked in the kind of cold that seemed to silence even the wind, turning the mountains into a maze of frozen ridges and shadowed valleys where only the desperate or the foolish wandered after sundown. Two hunters, both locals born with the mountain stubbornness in their bones, set out before dawn to track a wounded buck that had slipped through the pines the night before. They expected nothing more unusual than the usual crunch of frost under their boots and the distant echo of their own breath bouncing between the trees. Instead, they found themselves walking into a moment that would shatter decades of local silence. At first, it was just a strange shape at the edge of the tree line, something small and still like an abandoned bundle of clothes. But as the men stepped closer, the shapes lifted their heads in perfect unison. Two boys stood there barefoot in the snow, their skin so pale it almost absorbed the cold light of the morning. Their dark hair hung wet and tangled, and their clothes were thin, torn, and covered in a layer of dirt that looked almost painted on. The hunters recognized them instantly, not because they had ever seen the boys themselves, but because the faces were unmistakable: the Harlow Twins, the children who had vanished without a trace 13 years earlier. The men froze, unsure whether they were staring at ghosts or something living that pretended to be. The twins didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even seem to shiver despite the freezing air pressing against their bare feet. They simply watched the hunters with an unsettling stillness, as if waiting to see whether the men were friend or threat. One of the hunters, the older of the two, finally managed to speak, his voice cracking in the cold as he asked the boys where they had come from. The twins turned their heads slowly toward each other like mirrors, deciding who would answer. Then one of them lifted a hand and pointed back toward the dense line of trees behind them, deeper into the mountains where no path existed and no sane person traveled after dark. The hunters followed the direction of that trembling finger, but the forest revealed nothing but layers of shadows, slipping between trunks that seemed to lean closer the longer they looked. The older hunter whispered that the boys needed warmth immediately, but before he could reach out, both twins stepped back in perfect synchronization, as if afraid of being touched. Their lips were cracked, their eyes wide, and there was a hollow, almost bruised look across their faces that didn't belong to children. When the younger hunter finally gathered enough nerve to remove his coat and kneel in front of them, the twins allowed it. But something in their posture suggested hesitation, like they were waiting for something to follow them out of the trees. The mountains held their silence, the sky stayed a washed-out gray, and the hunters felt a growing certainty that the boys had not simply been lost out there. They had been living with something that had now realized they were gone and would not be pleased to find them missing. When the Harlow twins were brought into the nearest clinic, the staff expected the usual signs of exposure: frostbite, malnutrition, trauma from wandering alone in the mountains, but what they found instead pushed the room into an uneasy quiet. The boys' bodies were cold, far colder than any living child should be after receiving warmth for over an hour, and yet their pulses were steady, almost unnervingly calm. A nurse tried to take their temperature 3 times before finally assuming the equipment was faulty, because no matter how long she waited, the reading hovered at a level that should have indicated severe hypothermia, if not something worse. Their skin held a strange gray pallor under the surface, not sickly, but unnatural, as though color simply refused to return to them. The doctor who examined them frowned deeply when he noticed the identical scars running across both boys' torsos, thin, perfectly symmetrical lines that started beneath the ribs and curved upward like something had opened them from the inside and stitched them closed with a precision no mountain accident could explain. When he asked the twins where the scars came from, Both boys stared at him with matching expressions, neither confused nor frightened, but blank, as if the question itself carried a meaning they weren't ready to reveal. Their voices unsettled the staff even more. When the boys finally spoke, their words came out soft and hoarse, but with an eerie echo beneath them, a layered sound like someone whispering the same sentence a fraction of a second behind. At first, the doctor assumed it was the acoustics of the examination room, but even when he moved them to a different space, the unnatural echo lingered. The boys spoke rarely, only when asked direct questions, and even then their answers were short, clipped, more like recitations they had learned long ago than the natural speech of children. Their eyes told their own story. One twin possessed a mismatched pair, one dark as coal and the other a washed-out gray, while the second twin had eyes that shifted in color depending on the light flickering between brown and green in a way that made the nurses glance away after a few seconds. The clinic staff attempted to explain everything through logic. Perhaps the discoloration came from long-term malnourishment. Perhaps the scars were from an old surgery nobody remembered. Perhaps the unnatural calmness in their heart rates was some rare genetic quirk. But every explanation ended in the same uncomfortable conclusion. Children who had supposedly vanished at age 5 should not return looking as if time had carved itself into them, yet refused to change them in any normal way. Even their reactions to basic medical tests were off. Needles did not make them flinch, bright lights did not cause them to blink, and when a nurse accidentally dropped a metal tray behind them, the loud crash made everyone in the room jump, except the twins, who simply turned their heads at the same slow angle as if sound reached them differently. Rumors started forming almost immediately among the staff, quiet whispers exchanged behind partially closed doors. Some believed the boys had endured captivity so extreme it dulled their senses. Some suspected they had been part of some unrecorded medical experiment out in the deeper mountain pockets, and a few unable to shake the coldness that filled the room whenever the twins stared too long, wondered if the boys had brought something back with them that did not belong to the world the clinic understood. It was during the first night in the clinic, long after the doctors had finished their examinations and the nurses had gone home, that the Harlow twins finally spoke in a way that made the room tremble with the weight of what they carried. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and wood smoke from the stove in the corner, yet something heavier, almost metallic, seemed to press down from the corners of the ceiling. One of the twins, the one with the shifting green-brown eyes, leaned forward on the thin cot and whispered in a voice so quiet it could have been mistaken for the wind, yet somehow carried across the small room. "We weren't born." The doctor froze, pen hovering above the chart, unable to decipher whether it was a joke, a hallucination, or something much darker. The other twin, whose eyes were mismatched like shards of broken glass, echoed the words without prompting. "We weren't born. We were taken back." The phrasing was precise, deliberate, yet it carried an implication that made the hair on the back of the neck stand up. Taken back from somewhere, to somewhere, by someone or something unseen. The staff leaned closer, trying to coax more information, but the twins offered nothing further at first. They simply sat side by side, hands barely brushing, staring at some invisible point beyond the walls of the clinic. After a long, tense silence, the first twin added, "They said it was our time. But we weren't ready." The doctor's mind raced. Was this a reference to an accident, an illness, or something more sinister that had never been recorded? The twins were only 5 years old when they disappeared, yet their words carried an intelligence and weight far beyond their age, as if they had been forced to understand things that children were never meant to comprehend. As the night deepened, the twins' whispers continued in fragmented sentences, never forming a full story but giving glimpses of something almost inhuman. They spoke of tunnels beneath the mountains, rooms where the air tasted wrong, and figures that watched from shadows without moving. Occasionally, one of them would press a hand to his chest and shiver violently, muttering that they were still inside, waiting. Even the most rational staff members found themselves staring at the floor, trying to convince themselves that these were simple hallucinations brought on by trauma, but the synchronicity of the twins' speech, their mirrored gestures, and the unnatural cadence of their words left little room for normal explanations. The doctor attempted to record their statements, but every note seemed inadequate. The words alone could not capture the fear and the depth of memory in the twins' eyes. When pressed further, they both shook their heads in perfect unison, murmuring that some things could not be spoken aloud, that the truth itself had weight enough to crush a person if revealed too soon. And in the dim light, as the clinic's walls creaked with the winter wind, it became horrifyingly clear that whatever had taken the twins, shaped them, and returned them was not done. That their story, if it could even be called that, was only beginning, and that confession was merely the first tremor of something far larger waiting to emerge days after the Harlow Twins' initial confessions. The authorities, skeptical but uneasy, began investigating the old Harlow family cabin, the place the boys had vaguely indicated as the center of their terror. The cabin was not marked on any contemporary map, having been abandoned for over a decade, left to rot deep within the Appalachian backwoods where the forest swallowed roads and trails whole. It took 2 days for the search team to navigate the twisted paths of fallen trees, slick rocks and snowdrifts, each step deeper into the mountains, increasing the sense of isolation that pressed against them like a living thing. When the cabin finally appeared, it was more ruin than home. Its wooden walls warped and blackened by years of neglect and fire, its windows gaping like empty eye sockets. The smell of decay hit the team immediately: rotting wood, damp earth, and something far fouler, almost like iron and ash mixed together. The Harlow name was still etched on the threshold, worn but legible, and it was easy to imagine children once running across its floor, playing under the watch of an indifferent, shadowed world. Inside, the cabin was a frozen time capsule. Dust and cobwebs layered every surface, and old furniture sagged as if weighed down by the secrets of its former inhabitants. The walls were marked with scratches, not random but deliberate, as if someone had traced symbols over and over, leaving invisible patterns that seemed to pulse in the low light. The search team noted the fire pit in the center of the main room, still lined with ash that had not been fully consumed in decades, and the corners of the cabin held objects so strange that even experienced officers paused. A small pile of children's shoes, frayed dolls with their heads cracked open, and pieces of cloth sewn together in shapes no one could name. The air was heavy, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps following the intruders. It was in the back room that the investigation grew truly disturbing. A trapdoor, hidden beneath a tattered rug, led to a crawlspace beneath the cabin. The twins had referred to it vaguely, and now the authorities understood why. The small underground chamber was lined with dirt and splintered wooden planks, a narrow tunnel extending into darkness that seemed to go on far longer than the cabin's footprint should allow. In the corner, the walls were carved with symbols identical to the faint scars on the twins' bodies, strange geometric patterns that defied logical explanation and hinted at some ritual long abandoned but never forgotten. The air was cooler here, damper, and it smelled faintly metallic, like blood long dried but never washed away. Officers who had been skeptical of the twins' story now whispered to each other in disbelief, realizing that the cabin was not just abandoned, it was a shrine of some forgotten malevolent purpose. Each piece of evidence, the toys, the carvings, the hidden crawlspace, spoke of a family whose history was intertwined with something inhuman, something that had lingered in the shadows of the mountains for decades. And as the team continued to explore, moving cautiously through the warped corridors and brittle staircases, it became chillingly clear that the cabin had been waiting patiently for the Harlow twins' return, that whatever horrors had been practiced, they were far from finished, and that the mountains themselves had conspired to keep the truth sealed until the right moment arrived. After the Harlow cabin was explored, investigators began sifting through county records, old newspapers, and missing children reports, hoping to find some logical explanation for what had been uncovered. What they discovered was far more unsettling than any speculation could have imagined. For decades, the area surrounding the Harlow property had been marked by a quiet, almost invisible pattern of disappearances, each child vanishing without warning, leaving behind nothing but grief and unanswered questions. The files went back generations, nearly 50 years, and each report followed a similar cadence. A child aged 5 to 7 would vanish from a family homestead or rural trail, often during the winter months, sometimes leaving behind clothes or toys that would later be found in the forest, but never the children themselves. The pattern became even more chilling when the investigators noticed that the intervals between disappearances were consistent, occurring roughly every 13 years as if some unseen clock dictated their timing, and each occurrence centered near the dense mountains that loomed over the Harlow land. What caught their attention most was the repeated mention of a Harlow family connection. Even in cases predating the twins' disappearance by decades, there were scattered references to distant Harlow relatives in the reports, sometimes as neighbors, sometimes as caretakers, but always present in proximity to the vanished children. It suggested a lineage, a bloodline intertwined with the mountain's darkness, that somehow bore responsibility or was perpetually targeted by whatever force claimed the missing. Local oral histories added to the unease. Elderly residents whispered of strange rituals of children who weren't supposed to stay, and of the Harlow family speaking of debts owed to something in the deep woods. No one could recall exact details, dismissing the stories as folklore or exaggeration. But the official records paired with these tales painted a starkly different picture, a systematic and recurring tragedy, one that had been carefully hidden beneath the veneer of Appalachian isolation. Even the law enforcement officers, trained to separate superstition from evidence, struggled to reconcile the findings. They found small, overlooked clues scattered across case files, recurring descriptions of twins, oddly precise scars, children speaking in synchronized patterns, sometimes even claiming they remembered before they were born. These fragments mirrored the strange physical and behavioral traits of the Harlow twins who had reappeared in 1961. The investigators began to feel a creeping sense of inevitability, as if the mountains themselves had been orchestrating events, moving families, and selecting children according to some unfathomable plan. By the end of the week, the pattern was undeniable. Every 13 years, a child or children disappeared in the shadow of the Harlow property. The timeline stretched back far enough to suggest that the phenomenon had existed long before the modern records began. Perhaps hidden in oral histories and lost diaries, it was no longer a matter of isolated tragedy. It was a recurring event, a legacy of absence linked directly to the land, to the bloodline, and to the cabin that had remained untouched as if waiting for the next inevitable arrival. The county files and whispered stories merged into one grim conclusion. The Harlow twins' return was not a miracle or an accident. It was the continuation of a dark, precise, and terrifying pattern that no one had fully understood. One that hinted the mountains themselves were alive with memory, hungry for repetition, and determined to reclaim what it considered rightfully its own. As the investigation deepened, the Harlow twins' confessions grew darker and more incomprehensible, revealing memories that no child should possess and visions that no adult could fully process. During a late-night questioning session, the twins began to recount events that predated their disappearance in a manner so vivid that the clinicians and officers present could barely believe they were hearing the words of children. They spoke of living in the cabin not as ordinary humans but as vessels in a place that seemed to exist outside time. One twin described corridors that stretched longer than the cabin itself, rooms carved into the mountainside where light never penetrated, and figures that moved in the corners of the eye but vanished when looked at directly. The other twin's voice remained calm, almost monotone, as he described ceilings that dripped with condensation that smelled faintly of iron, and walls lined with symbols that pulsed faintly, like the slow beat of a heart hidden somewhere deep beneath the earth. The twins insisted that these memories were not dreams, not games, and not stories. They remembered dying in those spaces, both of them more than once, only two, awaken in different parts of the mountains as if the forest itself had stitched them back together. The scars on their bodies, once considered anomalies or accidents, were suddenly understood as records of these events, reminders etched in flesh that corresponded perfectly with the symbols the twins described. They spoke of being chosen, separated, observed, and returned, emphasizing that at each stage they had been aware of the purpose behind their suffering, yet powerless to intervene. One chilling element of their confession was the way the twins described the passage of time. In their memories, days stretched into months, months collapsed into hours, and yet every death they experienced was recorded with absolute clarity. They recounted moments of terror and curiosity with the same detached tone, sometimes laughing softly at events that should have made them scream. The officers noted that their behavior unnervingly synchronized suggested that they were not only remembering together, but thinking together, their identities overlapping in ways that made it impossible to separate one twin from the other in the telling of the story. Toward the end of the night, the twins made a statement that silenced the room entirely. They insisted that the Harlow cabin and the surrounding mountains were alive, aware, and patient, that time itself bent around the property, and that they had been preserved, changed, and returned precisely because the mountains demanded it. They implied that the disappearances over the decades, the patterns in the county records, and the ritual marks were all part of a single cycle that continued to this day. Every detail of their memory pointed to one terrifying conclusion, that the twins were not merely survivors but witnesses of something ongoing, something that had claimed generations and would not stop with them, and that what had been done to them was only the beginning of the mountain's plan. During a follow-up investigation at the Harlow cabin, authorities uncovered marks that would forever haunt those who saw them, symbols etched with a precision that made it clear they were not casual carvings, but intentional, ritualistic designs. The floorboards of the main room were scarred with concentric patterns, interwoven with angular shapes that resembled letters or numbers, though none could be deciphered. Some of the scratches were shallow, others deep enough to catch a fingernail, and all seemed to pulse under the flickering light of lanterns, creating an optical illusion that unsettled even the most experienced officers. The twins, when brought back to the cabin for identification purposes, immediately recognized the carvings and froze. One of them knelt and traced a line with his fingers, whispering that it matched the way they touch us. The other twin crouched beside him, murmuring the same phrase almost reverently, as if these marks were part of a language written in pain and memory. The connection between the carvings and the twins' bodies became painfully clear when the investigators noticed that the scars along their torsos, arms, and legs mirrored the shapes of the symbols in the cabin. The marks were identical in placement and form, almost as if the twins themselves had been used to create the design, or had been marked by the design in some incomprehensible symbiotic process. No conventional explanation sufficed. Medical experts confirmed that the scars were neither surgical nor accidental, and the precision suggested deliberate action over an extended period. The twins would not elaborate on how it happened, only whispering phrases like, "They follow the lines," and "We feel them when they move," hinting at some supernatural or ritualistic connection between their bodies and the carvings in the cabin. The officers who documented the symbols reported an intense, almost physical reaction upon entering the room. A heavy pressure settled in the air, and a faint metallic scent lingered, rising in waves like breath from a living thing. Photographs taken of the carvings revealed odd anomalies in shadows and light, strange distortions that could not be explained by camera error. Some of the symbols appeared to shift slightly between exposures, and those standing closest to them reported headaches, nausea, and an annoying sense of dread. The twins, when asked about these sensations, nodded gravely, confirming that the carvings were alive in a way, that the room remembered and reacted, that the marks had been made to channel something unseen and eternal. Further inspection revealed that the symbols extended beyond the cabin floor into the walls, the ceiling beams, and even into the hidden crawlspaces beneath the house. The twins showed the investigators corners of the cabin that had previously gone unnoticed, places where the carvings had been etched in near total darkness, visible only when light struck at the correct angle. They said these sections were the places where the world watches and waits, and that anyone who lingered there too long would begin to feel the same pull the twins had endured for years. The realization struck the team that the carvings were not just decorative or protective, they were functional, part of a pattern that bound the twins' bodies, the cabin, and the mountains together in a living network of ritual energy, designed to ensure the continuation of something ancient, something that had already claimed generations before the twins' return, and something that would claim again. The final revelation came gradually, in fragments, as investigators pieced together the Harlow Twins' confessions, the cabin's strange markings, and the county records documenting decades of disappearances. The twins spoke in whispers that carried a weight beyond their years, describing a force in the mountains older than any living resident, something that existed in the shadows of the Appalachians and demanded devotion through a cycle of blood fear and ritual. They said the Harlow family had long ago entered into a pact with this presence, a promise sealed in secrecy and violence that required each generation to contribute to its continuation. The twins themselves were the latest link in a chain that stretched back to the earliest settlers in the valley, their lives shaped and constrained by rules written not in law but in the unyielding will of something that was patient, intelligent, and merciless. Every detail the twins recalled aligned with this dark lineage. They remembered faces that were not human, figures that drifted just beyond the edge of vision, and ceremonies where the boundaries between the living and the claimed blurred entirely. They spoke of being watched, measured, and prepared, not for ordinary life, but for the mountain's purpose and unspoken destiny that had always existed and could not be altered. Their scars, their synchronized movements, their unnatural calm, they were all part of a design to ensure that the pact remained intact, that the Harlow bloodline fulfilled its obligation to whatever lingered beneath the forest canopy. The investigators, initially seeking evidence of human error or criminal activity, realized that the twins' story transcended the ordinary. It was as if the very land, the mountains, the air, and the trees themselves were complicit, shaping events to preserve a pattern older than any of them could fully comprehend. The twins described moments where the forest seemed to breathe, where the shadows shifted in acknowledgement of their presence, and where sounds that should have been impossible to hear were transmitted directly into their minds. They spoke of other children, long gone, who had vanished in previous cycles and whose lives had been offered to this force, each disappearance a thread woven into the mountain's memory. They said that the cabin, the carvings, and even the bloodlines themselves were conduits, channels through which the force exerted influence, ensuring its persistence and survival. And they warned that it was not bound by time as humans understood it. What had happened before could happen again, and what was now witnessed was only a pause in a continuous cycle that would resume inevitably. By the time the authorities had absorbed the twins' confessions, the cabin had been sealed, records secured, and yet a profound unease lingered in everyone who had been present. The mountains did not forget, the shadows did not forgive, and the pact, made long before the twins were born, was as active and as binding as ever. It was a revelation that reframed every disappearance, every story, and every warning passed down through the valley for generations. The Harlow bloodline was never free, and whatever claimed it was still watching, still waiting, and still patient. And that is why, if you want to uncover more dark secrets from history that will chill you to the bone, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.